The realtor thought I was insane. She stood at the edge of the gravel turnout, where the paved road dissolved into packed dirt and wild sage, her blazer catching Pacific wind, and she looked at me the way people look at someone signing a document they haven't read. The listing had been active for 11 months. No offers. The previous owner died in a facility in Mendocino, and his children wanted nothing to do with the property. 3 bedrooms cantilevered over a 90-foot cliff face on the Sonoma coast, north of Jenner, south of nothing. The foundation was original. Poured concrete from 1974, bolted directly into metamorphic rock with expansion anchors that had never been recertified. The south-facing deck listed 4 degrees. The access road was a single lane that switched back twice before it reached the county route. And in winter, mudslides closed it for days. I paid asking price in cash. Every dollar I had. Every dollar I'd saved across 14 years of structural engineering consulting, 2 dissolved partnerships, and 1 divorce that left me with liquidity instead of love. $387,000 for a house most people would have condemned, but I didn't buy it to live in it. I bought it to make it survive. If you want to hear why I chose this cliff over safety, consider subscribing. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far this reaches. That distinction mattered to me then, and it matters more to me now. Sitting in the dark on the interior stairwell, with salt air leaking through the seams and the sound of something pulling itself along the trail below. But I'll get to that. My name is Carver Lind. I was 41 years old the day I closed escrow, and I had spent the previous 18 months reading infrastructure failure reports from every major disaster of the last half-century. Katrina, Fukushima, the Christchurch earthquake, Hurricane Maria. Not because I believed the world was ending. Because I understood, professionally and mathematically, that the distance between ordinary life and structural collapse was thinner than most people wanted to know. I had inspected buildings after the Napa earthquake in 2014. I had watched a parking structure fold in on itself like a paper lantern because one contractor substituted rebar grades to save $11,000. I stopped trusting systems after that. Not people. Systems. The house was the answer. Not a bunker. Not a fantasy. A real structural project. One I could engineer from the foundation up with my own hands and my own calculations. The cliff gave me what no suburban lot or rural acreage could. A single axis of approach. 1 road in. 3 sides of sheer rock face dropping to the Pacific. No neighbor within a mile and a half. And beneath the house, carved into the cliff by the original owner for reasons no one in the county office could explain, a natural sea cave that the tide filled twice a day and drained twice a day, leaving behind pools of cold, clean, filterable water. I did not know what was coming. I want to be clear about that. I was not a prepper in the way that word gets used. No ideology, no manifesto, no YouTube channel with night vision footage of me running drills. I was an engineer who had lost faith in shared infrastructure and decided to pour that anxiety into something I could physically verify. Every bolt, every weld, every load-bearing calculation. I started reinforcement in March. By June, I had replaced the foundation anchors with 12-inch chemical epoxy bolts rated for seismic zone 4. I had poured a secondary retaining wall along the cliff edge using marine-grade concrete with polymer fiber reinforcement. I had installed steel core doors on both entries, mounted on commercial-grade hinges with 3-point locking mechanisms I sourced from a decommissioned Coast Guard station in Eureka. I had reframed the deck with galvanized steel box beams and replaced every window on the ground floor with laminated security glass. Not bulletproof, but rated to withstand sustained impact without shattering into the interior. The house became, by any honest measure, a fortress. And then, in August, Naya Marin drove up my road in a dust-covered Subaru with a cracked windshield and told me that people in Guerneville were biting each other and the cell towers had been down for 6 hours. I didn't believe her. That was my first mistake. She was sitting on my hood when I came around the north side of the house carrying a sheet of diamond plate steel I'd been cutting to size for the crawl space hatch. I dropped it against the foundation wall and stared at her. She was maybe 30, black, with short natural hair pressed flat on one side like she'd been sleeping in her car. Her left hand was wrapped in a dish towel, spotted brown with dried blood. She was calm in a way that unsettled me. Not the calm of someone in control, but the calm of someone who had already processed the worst thing and come out the other side of it glassy and precise. "Your road's the only one not blocked past Bridgehaven," she said. "I tried 3 others. Trees down or cars sideways. Somebody's doing it on purpose." I asked her what happened to her hand. She unwrapped the towel without hesitation. A bite mark. Human, clearly. On the meat of her palm below the thumb, deep enough to need stitches. She had cleaned it with what smelled like vodka and packed it with gauze she'd taken from a first aid kit, still sitting open on her passenger seat. "A man at the gas station in Jenner," she said. "He was standing behind the counter when I walked in. I thought he worked there. He grabbed my hand and bit down before I could even ask for directions. There was something wrong with his mouth. His gums were black. I told her she needed a hospital. She told me the hospital in Santa Rosa wasn't answering. She'd called 6 times. Then the calls stopped connecting. Then her phone lost signal entirely. Naya Marin was a marine biologist on a postdoc fellowship at Bodega Marine Lab. She had been driving north from a field site near Tomales Bay when the radio started broadcasting a civil emergency alert on loop. No details, just a tone and the instruction to shelter in place. When she stopped for gas, the world she understood ended, and the one I had been quietly building toward began. I let her inside. I didn't do it out of generosity. I did it because she was educated. She was composed under duress. And she had information I didn't have. That's a calculation I'm not proud of, but it was accurate. And in the weeks that followed, it kept us both breathing. That first night, we sat at my kitchen table, the one room I hadn't torn apart for renovation, and she told me what she'd seen on the drive. A car flipped on Highway 1. Near Bodega Bay, with the driver still buckled in, jaw working open and closed, fingers scraping the cracked windshield from the inside. 2 people on the shoulder near Salmon Creek, walking with a gait she described as mechanical. Knees not bending properly, arms hanging with the wrong kind of looseness. She hadn't stopped. She'd accelerated through the curves fast enough to crack her windshield on a low-hanging eucalyptus branch, and she hadn't slowed down until she found my road. I showed her the house, not out of pride, out of necessity. I needed her to understand what the structure could do so she would stop looking at the windows like they were made of paper. I showed her the anchors, the locking doors, the reinforced deck, the crawl space hatch that led to the sea cave below. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question: "What about food?" I had a 60-day supply: canned goods, vacuum-sealed rice, protein powder, water purification tablets, a gravity filter rated for 15,000 gallons. 60 days for 1 person, 30 for 2. I told her that number honestly. She nodded. "Then I'll earn my half." It wasn't a request. It was a contract offer. I understood that immediately, and I respected it. She didn't want to be sheltered. She wanted to be structural, load-bearing, not decorative. She used that exact metaphor, and I realized she'd already read me more accurately than I'd read her. We divided the house that night. She took the 2nd bedroom. I kept the primary. The 3rd bedroom became storage. And outside, below the cliff, the tide came in and erased whatever tracks she'd left on the road. By the 3rd day, the road answered the question I hadn't wanted to ask. I had mounted a long-range spotting scope on the upper deck, a vortex razor I'd originally bought for watching gray whale migration. And through it, just after dawn, I saw them. 3 figures on the county route, half a mile south. They weren't walking toward anything. They were just walking. The mechanical gait Naya had described was immediately recognizable even at distance, and a rhythmic, piston-like stride that never adjusted for terrain. One of them stepped off the asphalt onto the gravel shoulder and continued at exactly the same pace, ankle rolling on loose rock without correction. No flinch, no stumble, just continuous, indifferent forward motion. I called Naya up to the deck. She watched through the scope for a full minute without speaking. "They're thermoregulating," she said quietly. "I didn't understand," she explained. "They were walking in and out of the fog shadow cast by the ridge, moving into direct sunlight, pausing, then continuing. Not consciously, but their bodies were cycling through sun and shade like reptiles." She said the movement pattern was consistent with organisms operating on brainstem function alone. No frontal lobe planning, no spatial reasoning, just metabolic response to environmental stimulus. "They're not hunting," she said. "They're grazing, on heat." That observation changed everything I thought about defense. I had built the house to resist deliberate assault, human assault, with tools and intent and tactical thinking. What Naya was describing was something entirely different, a threat that moved without purpose, but responded to stimulus, which meant they wouldn't come up my road because they wanted what I had. They'd come up my road because something, sound, heat, light, pulled them. I spent that afternoon auditing every system in the house for output. The generator was the worst offender. A 7,500-watt gasoline unit I'd installed in a ventilated shed on the north side. When it ran, it produced noise, heat, and exhaust. A 3-channel beacon. I shut it down and didn't restart it. We shifted to the solar array I'd mounted on the roof the previous month. 4 400-watt panels feeding a battery bank in the crawl space. Silent, cool, invisible from the road. Naya helped me inventory every light source, every heat source, every piece of equipment that vibrated or hummed. We killed the refrigerator. We moved all perishables into the sea cave, where the ambient temperature held at 51 degrees year-round. We taped blackout fabric over the windows, not for concealment from intelligent eyes, but to prevent thermal and light bleed that might register to something operating on stimulants alone. By sunset, the house was dark and quiet in a way it had never been. We ate cold rice and canned black beans by the light of a single red-filtered headlamp, speaking in low voices, not because we'd agreed to, but because the silence of the house demanded it. "You built all of this for the wrong threat," Naya said. Not cruelly, clinically. She was right. I had built a fortress to resist human siege. Doors that couldn't be kicked in, windows that couldn't be smashed, a foundation that couldn't be undermined. But the thing moving along the coast road didn't kick. It didn't strategize. It followed gradients the way water follows gravity. And my house, for all its engineering, was still a point source of energy on an otherwise empty coastline. The realization should have devastated me. It didn't. It recalibrated me. Because the inverse was also true. If they followed stimulus, then stimulus could be managed, eliminated, redirected. The house didn't need to be a fortress. It needed to be a ghost. Present but imperceptible, existing in the landscape without registering on whatever rudimentary sensory architecture was driving those bodies along the road. I pulled out my engineering notebooks and started recalculating. Not load tolerances this time. Signal profiles, thermal signatures, acoustic leakage. The math was different, but the discipline was the same. And for the first time since Naya arrived, I felt the satisfaction of a problem I was specifically qualified to solve. Below us, the tide drained out. Above us, the stars appeared through fog breaks, indifferent and cold and exactly where they were supposed to be. On day 9, someone else found the road. I was in the sea cave running a flow rate test on the gravity filter when Naya called down through the crawl space hatch. Her voice was flat and controlled, which by then I recognized as her signal for genuine alarm. I climbed the ladder and found her at the spotting scope, angled not toward the coast road, but uphill, toward the switchback where the gravel track doubled back on itself before reaching my gate. A man was sitting in the middle of the road, not walking, sitting, cross-legged, like he was meditating, with a backpack beside him and both hands raised above his head, palms open. A surrender posture, deliberate, human. He's been there for 20 minutes, Naya said. He hasn't moved. He hasn't called out. That restraint was what made me take him seriously. Anyone desperate enough to find this road and climb it would have been yelling for help. Unless they understood that yelling was what drew the wrong attention. This man understood. He was sitting in the open, visible, silent, and waiting. I took the scope. He was older than us. Mid-50s maybe. White, weathered, with a gray beard cut short and practical. His clothes were layered and filthy, but deliberately chosen. Hiking boots, cargo pants, a canvas jacket with the sleeves rolled. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and I could see the outline of a sheathed knife on his belt, but no firearm. His backpack was a professional-grade mountaineering pack, heavy and well-organized. "I'm going down," I said. "No." Naya didn't look away from the scope. "I'm going down. You stay on the deck with the scope and the flare gun. If something's wrong, I need someone with a vantage point, not someone standing next to me on the same level." She was right, and I didn't argue. And I noticed for the first time that our decisions had begun routing through tactical logic, without discussion. We had become, in 9 days, a unit that allocated roles by advantage rather than instinct. She went down. I watched. Through the scope, I saw her approach him on the road. He didn't stand. He kept his hands up. They spoke for several minutes. I couldn't hear the words, but I watched their body language. Naya stood with her weight on her back foot, angled slightly so her wounded hand was away from him. He spoke steadily, gesturing occasionally toward the south with one hand, always returning it above his head. At one point, Naya crouched to his level, and he showed her something from his jacket pocket. She examined it, handed it back, and looked up toward the house. She raised her right hand and made a single slow circle in the air. Our improvised signal for, "Come down, it's clear." I descended with the flare gun anyway. His name was Orrin Voss. He was a retired Cal Fire Battalion chief who had been living alone in a cabin near Fort Ross when the emergency broadcasts started. He had spent the first week monitoring his scanner, cataloging what he heard. Local sheriff channels dissolving into static, HP dispatches growing increasingly incoherent. A single Coast Guard transmission on day 4 that said, "Waitataikavanda, coastal evacuation suspended," and then went silent. When his cabin's propane tank ran dry on day 7, he'd packed his bag and started walking north along the ridgeline, staying above the fog line where visibility was better and the infected. He called them drifters. The first name I'd heard anyone use were sparse. He'd found my road by accident. Or rather, he'd found the absence of blockage on my road and recognized it as meaningful. The only access route in 20 miles that hadn't been obstructed by abandoned vehicles or deliberate barricades. "Someone cleared this road," he said, looking at me. "Recently, with a chain and a truck." He was right. I had pulled 2 abandoned cars off the lower switchback with my F-250 on day 5. I hadn't considered that the cleared road was itself a human signature on the landscape, as legible as the heat and noise I'd spent days eliminating. My fortress was whispering, even when I thought it was silent. Orrin earned his place the same way Naya had. Not by asking, but by demonstrating a capacity we lacked. On his second morning, he hiked the ridgeline above the house and returned 3 hours later with a hand-drawn topographic map of every approach within a 2-mile radius. Not approximate, precise. He had spent 31 years reading terrain for fire behavior. Slope, aspect, fuel load, wind channels, and that knowledge translated seamlessly into the threat path analysis. He could look at a hillside and tell you where a body moving on gradient of response would naturally funnel, the way he'd once predicted where a fire would crown. He identified 3 vulnerability corridors. The road was the most obvious. but two seasonal drainage channels cut through the coastal scrub on the south face of the ridge, and both terminated within 400 yards of the house. They were natural pathways, downhill, sheltered from wind, lined with soft earth that wouldn't impede even the graceless stride of the infected. Anything moving along the coast that drifted inland would find those channels the way rainwater did. Passively, inevitably. We spent 2 days blocking them, not with walls. Walls were visible, and visible structures attracted investigation from the human survivors we weren't yet sure we wanted to find us. Instead, Oren suggested a technique from wildfire management: constructed fuel breaks. We cut the scrub in bands across each channel and piled it in loose berms that disrupted the smooth gradient. The footing became uneven, unpredictable. A drifter operating on brainstem locomotion would encounter terrain that demanded motor adjustment it couldn't perform. It wouldn't stop them permanently, but it would slow them, redirect them, turn the channels from highways into friction zones. Naya observed the work with a different interest. She had been keeping a journal since she arrived. Not a diary, a data log. She recorded weather, tide times, fog density, and every drifter sighting from the spotting scope, noting time, direction of travel, apparent speed, and proximity to heat or light sources. By day 12, she had enough data to identify a pattern none of us had expected. "They're tidal," she said. We were sitting in the kitchen, eating rehydrated lentil soup by red light. She had her journal open, columns of numbers running down pages in tight handwriting. Their movement correlates with barometric pressure shifts that track the tidal cycle. When the tide comes in and onshore pressure builds, they move inland. When it recedes and pressure drops, they drift back toward the coast. It's not exact. It's a tendency, not a rule. But it's consistent enough to predict windows. She showed us the numbers. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was there. A rhythmic oscillation in drifter density on the road that synced with the 12-hour tidal pattern. High tide pushed them up. Low tide pulled them down. We were living on a cliff above an ocean that breathed the threat toward us, and then drew it away, twice a day, like a bellows. Oren studied her data for a long time. Then he said something that reframed how I understood our position entirely. "So we're not on a cliff. We're on a shore break. And the tide is made of bodies." The metaphor was grotesque, but structurally exact. And it meant our survival calculus had a variable I hadn't accounted for. Time of day mattered. The windows between high tides, roughly 6 hours, were periods of relative safety. Movement outside the house, resource gathering, maintenance, all of it could be scheduled around a biological tide chart that NICE was now equipped to maintain. For the first time, I felt something beyond controlled anxiety. I felt operational. We had a system. Oren's terrain analysis gave us spatial awareness. Naya's tidal model gave us temporal awareness. My engineering gave us structural integrity. 3 people, 3 disciplines, 3 layers of defense that interlocked without redundancy. That evening, I stood on the deck and watched the fog roll in from the south, swallowing the coast road in gray wool. Somewhere inside it, things were moving. But for the first time, I understood the rhythm of their movement, and understanding, even of something terrible, felt like the first material of safety. On day 16, during a low tide window, Naya and I drove the F-250 down to the county road to salvage supplies from an abandoned vacation rental we'd spotted through the scope. Oren stayed on the deck with the flare gun and the scope, monitoring our route and the road behind us. The rental was a 2-story cedar A-frame set back from the road in a stand of bishop pines. Its front door was open. A suitcase lay on the porch, unzipped, clothes spilling out in a way that suggested interrupted packing rather than looting. Inside, the refrigerator had already turned biological. We didn't open it, but the pantry was stocked for a vacation that never happened. Canned soups, pasta, olive oil, coffee, a case of bottled water, and an unopened 10-pound bag of jasmine rice that made Naya close her eyes briefly when she lifted it from the shelf. We loaded the truck in 12 minutes. We had rehearsed it. Specific items prioritized. Packing order predetermined. Maximum time on site agreed in advance. Oren's voice crackled on the two-way radio twice. Road clear north, road clear south. We worked without speaking. On the way back, passing through the section of coast road that ran closest to the waterline, I saw my first drifter at close range. It was standing in the drainage ditch on the seaward side of the road, waist deep in brown water and beach grass. Female, or it had been. The hair was long and matted, the clothing a torn sundress that had faded to an indeterminate gray. Its skin had a quality I can only describe as tidal, mottled and waterlogged, like driftwood that had been submerged and resurfaced repeatedly. Its eyes were open but unfocused, pointed at the sky, and its jaw was working in a slow, repetitive motion. Open, close, like a fish pulled from water. It did not look at us. The truck passed within 15 feet, and its head did not turn. Naya gripped the dashboard but didn't speak. I kept speed constant. No acceleration, no braking, no change in engine pitch. We passed it the way you pass a rock in the road, and I watched in the side mirror as it remained motionless in the ditch. Jaw still working, eyes still empty. When we reached the switchback, I stopped the truck and put my forehead on the steering wheel. "That was a person," I said. "No," Naya said. "That was a body running residual motor patterns. The person is gone." She was right, scientifically. But seeing it, the sundress, the long hair, the jaw, working as if still trying to speak, collapsed the abstraction I had been operating under. I had been treating the infected as an engineering problem, stimulus response organisms, variables in a threat model. Seeing one at 15 feet, close enough to hear the wet click of its jaw through the closed window, made the problem a person again. Somebody had put on that sundress expecting a day at the beach. Somebody had driven to this coast for the same reason I had. Because it was beautiful and far away, and felt like it existed outside the grid of ordinary failure. Naya let me sit for 30 seconds. Then she said, "We need to move. Tide turns in 4 hours." I drove. We unloaded. We cataloged. The rice went into sealed bins in the sea cave. The canned goods were sorted by caloric density and shelved in the third bedroom. The coffee Oren received like a sacrament, holding the sealed bag to his chest with both hands and breathing in through the foil. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood at the upstairs window, blackout curtain pulled aside just enough to see the moonlit road below, and thought about the woman in the ditch. Not what she was now, what she had been the week before, the day before, the hour before whatever happened to her happened, whether she had been alone, whether someone was still looking for her. I let the curtain fall and went to bed, and I did not look out the window again for a long time. On the day 22, Oren brought back a radio. He'd been making longer reconnaissance hikes along the ridgeline, mapping the expanding territory of his mental fire behavior model, when he found an overturned Caltrans maintenance truck in a ravine below the ridge road. The cab was empty. Door open, no body, no blood. But in the truck bed, bolted to a steel utility rack, was a VHF mobile radio unit with a long whip antenna, still connected to the truck's battery. The battery was dead, but the unit was intact. It took me 2 days to adapt it to our solar system. The radio drew more power than I wanted to spare, so we limited operation to twice daily. 30 minutes at dawn, 30 minutes at dusk. During the tidal lulls, Naya had mapped. Oren tuned through frequencies methodically, starting with Caltrans and Cal Fire channels he knew from memory, then expanding to Sheriff, Highway Patrol, Coast Guard, and civilian emergency bands. For 3 days, we heard nothing but static and the occasional phantom bleed of automated weather stations still running on battery backup, reporting conditions to no one. On the 4th day, during the dusk window, A voice broke through on a marine VHF channel. Channel 72, a frequency typically used for ship-to-ship non-commercial traffic. It was a woman. Her transmission was clipped and professional, with the cadence of someone accustomed to radio discipline. This is motor vessel Cormorant, 12 nautical miles west of Point Arena. Party of 19 aboard. We are monitoring this channel at 0600 and 1800 daily. If you can hear this, respond on this frequency. Cormorant standing by. Oren looked at me. I looked at Naya. The three of us stood around the radio in the darkened kitchen and listened to the hiss that followed her transmission. And nobody spoke for a full 10 seconds. 19 people on a boat, Naya said. 12 miles offshore? They've been out there at least since the towers went down, Oren said. Probably longer. Fuel and water are the constraint. They can't stay out forever. I understood the calculation he was making before he finished it. A vessel with 19 people had finite fuel, finite fresh water, and finite food. They were broadcasting because they needed to come ashore, and they were broadcasting on a ship-to-ship channel rather than an emergency channel because they had already tried emergency channels and got no response from any authority. They needed land. We had land. They had numbers and possibly skills and supplies we couldn't generate alone. The logic of contact was obvious. So was the risk. 19 people changes this place completely, I said. We're calibrated for 3. Our signal profile, our food calculus, our tidal windows, all of it assumes 3 bodies producing 3 bodies worth of heat, noise, and waste. 19 collapses every margin we've built. They're going to come ashore somewhere, Oren said. They'll pick a spot with vehicle access, flat ground, proximity to structures. Exactly the kind of terrain the drifters accumulate on. Without guidance, they'll land in a kill zone. He wasn't arguing for charity. He was arguing for control. If the Cormorant came ashore blind, they'd draw a drifter response to the coastline in our operational area. The disruption to our tidal model would be worse than the disruption of integrating them deliberately. Naya had been quiet. She was looking at her journal, flipping to the page where she'd mapped barometric correlations. If we contact them, she said, we choose the landing site. We choose the timing. We shape the approach around what we know. If we don't, they choose, and they'll choose wrong. The argument was sound. It was also the first time our survival model expanded from defensive to directional. We weren't just managing our own footprint anymore. We were preparing to manage others, to extend what we'd learned outward, to make our knowledge the infrastructure rather than our walls. I keyed the microphone at the next dawn window and spoke to the open ocean for the first time. Motor vessel Cormorant. This is a shore station north of Jenner. 3 survivors, secure position. We can guide your approach. Respond on this channel. Silence. Then, shore station, Cormorant copies. Go ahead. Her name was Daria Kessler, and she had been the Cormorant's first mate before she became its captain by default. The actual captain. Her employer, a retired tech executive who'd purchased the 72-foot motor yacht as a floating office for his post-retirement life, had been bitten during a supply run to a marina in Bodega Bay on the 3rd day. Daria had watched the infection take him over 9 hours, documented his decline on a handheld camcorder with the precision of a ship's log entry, and then locked him in the aft cabin when he stopped responding to his name. He was still in there, she told me. She could hear him moving behind the door when the seas were calm. The remaining 18 were a mixture. The captain's personal chef, a married couple who'd been guests aboard when departure became mandatory, a deckhand named Tomas, who was 19 and had never been more than 50 miles from Sausalito before this, and 13 strangers they'd pulled from the water or from small craft over the subsequent days. Fishermen, kayakers, one man who'd been clinging to an overturned sailboat in his boxer shorts, hypothermic and silent, who turned out to be a veterinarian from Petaluma. They had fuel for approximately 72 more hours of cruising. Fresh water for 4 days, rationed. Food for 6. The ocean had kept them alive, but it was not sustainable. It, as Daria put it over the radio with characteristic bluntness, a delay, not a solution. Over 2 days of scheduled radio contacts, we negotiated the landing. I use that word deliberately. Negotiated, not planned, because from the first transmission, Daria and I were establishing terms. She would bring her people ashore at a location and time we specified. She would accept our guidance on noise and light discipline. In return, she wanted structural participation. Not refuge, not charity, but a seat at whatever decision-making architecture we had built. I'm not delivering 19 people to someone's private compound to be told where to sleep, she said. We integrate, or we don't land. Naya, listening beside me, raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Oren, on the deck with the scope, said nothing over the radio, but wrote a single word on a scrap of paper and held it up to the window where I could see it. Terms. He was right. We needed explicit terms. Not because we distrusted Daria specifically, but because the transition from 3 people operating on implicit consensus to 22 people with competing needs and no shared history required structure that handshakes couldn't provide. I spent an evening writing what I called an operating framework. Not rules, not laws, but a set of shared protocols. Signal discipline. No lights after dark, no generators. No unnecessary sound above conversational volume. Movement discipline. All external movements scheduled within Naya's tidal windows. Resource discipline. All supplies centrally inventoried, distributed by a rotating committee of 3. Decision structure. Proposals raised by anyone, discussed openly, decided by consensus of the original 3 plus Daria as the Cormorant Group's representative. If consensus failed, the decision defaulted to the most conservative option, the choice that risked least. I read the framework to Daria over the radio. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Your most conservative default clause means any one person can block any action. That gives you veto power on everything. It gives anyone veto power. But you're the one with the house." She was right, and the asymmetry she identified was real. I had structural advantage. The literal structure was mine, built by my money and my labor on my land. Any framework I proposed would carry the gravity of that ownership, whether I intended it or not. Daria saw this immediately, and her willingness to name it before she set foot on shore told me more about her capacity for leadership than anything else she'd said. "What would you change?" I asked. "Vetoes expire," she said. 24-hour hold, then it goes to a full group vote. Simple majority. I accepted. It was the right amendment. And it was the moment I stopped being the owner of a fortress and became one member of something I hadn't designed. They came ashore on day 28, during the deepest low-tide window Naya had recorded. A 7-hour period of offshore pressure that correlated with minimal drifter activity along the coast road. Oren had identified a landing site, a small protected cove a quarter-mile north of the house, accessible from the water but invisible from the road, with a steep scramble trail leading up to the ridge. I watched through the scope as the Cormorant nosed into the cove at first light. Daria handled the yacht with an economy of motion that revealed deep competence. She swung the stern toward the rocky shelf, held position with the bow thruster, and began offloading people into a rigid, inflatable dinghy 4 at a time. Tomas, the deckhand, ferried each group to the rocks, where Oren waited to guide them up the trail. The whole operation took 90 minutes. No one spoke above a whisper. No one slipped. No one panicked. When the last group came ashore, Daria cut the Cormorant's engines, set the anchor in the cove's sandy bottom, and came ashore herself. She was the last one off the boat. She was taller than I'd expected from her voice. 5'10" maybe, with the posture of someone who was accustomed to standing on moving surfaces. She wore her dark hair tied back in a practical braid, and her handshake, when she gripped mine at the top of the trail, was the handshake of someone who had hauled rope for a living. "Smaller than I pictured," she said, looking at the house. "It's bigger underground," I said. And then I showed her the sea cave, and she went quiet for a long time. The integration was not smooth. 22 people in a 3-bedroom house designed for one was a compression problem I had no engineering solution for. The house itself could only sleep 8 indoors. The 3 bedrooms and the living room. Oren proposed and constructed, with help from Tomas and 2 of the fishing boat survivors, a series of sheltered bivouac sites along the ridge above the house, tucked into natural depressions in the rock and concealed by scrub. Canvas tarps, sleeping bags sourced from the cormorant stores, no fires, no lanterns, bodies warmed by proximity and insulation alone. The food calculus was worse. Our 60-day supply for 1 had already been reduced to a 20-day supply for 3. Adding 19 people turned it into a 4-day supply. Daria's shipboard stores extended that to 12. But 12 days was not a timeline. It was a countdown. Naya solved this. On her 3rd day of observing the sea cave's tidal pools at low water, she identified 3 species of edible invertebrate, mussels, turban snails, and purple sea urchins. In quantities she estimated could supplement our protein needs indefinitely. She organized a harvesting rotation. Teams of 3, during low tide windows only, collecting from the intertidal zone below the cliff, using nets and buckets lowered on ropes from the deck. The veterinarian from Petaluma. His name was Glenn, and he turned out to be relentlessly practical. Took charge of preparation, cleaning, and cooking the catch in the sea cave, using a small propane backpacking stove whose thermal output was negligible. But food and shelter were mechanical problems. The harder problem was social. 22 people living in enforced silence on a cliff, forbidden from moving freely, governed by protocols they hadn't written, with a threat they could observe, but not fight. This created a pressure I hadn't anticipated and couldn't engineer away. On the 3rd night after landing, I heard an argument from one of the ridge bivouacs, 2 of the cormorant survivors. The married couple, Victor and Lena, were questioning the tidal window model. Why couldn't they walk to the road during the day? Why couldn't they drive to the nearest town and look for other survivors? They had seen the drifters from the boat. They weren't that many. They weren't that fast. The restrictions felt disproportionate to the visible threat. Naya stood on the ridge in the dark and explained her data in calm, measured terms. Victor listened. Lena did not. "You're not our warden," Lena said, "and this isn't a prison." We had, until that moment, avoided the question of what it actually was. The answer came not from argument, but from demonstration, and the demonstration was not intentional. On day 33, Victor left the compound during a high tide period. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask permission. He waited until the pre-dawn dark, when the ridge bivouacs were quiet and the house watch had cycled to Glenn, who was monitoring the scope indoors, and didn't see Victor descend the road on foot. He took a flashlight, a knife, a day pack with water, and a can of peaches. He told Lena he was going to walk to Jenner, 7 miles south, to see if there were other survivors, a functioning radio, a vehicle, anything that expanded the options beyond what he called sitting on a rock watching the ocean. We didn't know he was gone until Lena came to the house at dawn, red-eyed and shaking, and told Daria, because Daria told me. I was already at the scope. I found him through the glass at 7:14 a.m., roughly 2 miles south on the coast road, moving at a steady walk. He was alone. The road behind him was clear. The road ahead was not. 3 drifters were converging from the east, from the scrub above the road, moving down a drainage channel that Oren had mapped but not yet blocked. It was outside our immediate perimeter, lower priority. They were descending on a gradient path that would intersect the road approximately 200 yards ahead of Victor. He couldn't see them. The road curved around a rock outcropping that blocked his sight line, and he was walking with a flashlight in his hand. Off now, in the daylight, but still a reflective metal object catching sun with every arm swing. I called Oren and Naya to the deck. The 3 of us watched. He'll see them when he rounds the curve, Oren said. Maybe 60 yards of reaction distance. Will they see him first? I asked. They're not seeing anything, Naya said. They're following the gradient of the channel. When they hit the road surface, they'll either continue across or turn along it, depending on whether a stronger stimulus pulls them. Victor was the stronger stimulus. A warm, moving body, producing footstep vibrations on asphalt. Every metric Naya had cataloged said the drifters would orient toward him once they reached the road. We have to go get him, Lena said from behind us. She had followed us to the deck. If we drive down there, we add a second stimulus source, Naya said. Engine noise, exhaust, vibration. We attract everything within a quarter mile, and we put 2 groups at risk instead of 1. He's my husband, and if we get him killed trying to save him with a truck, you'll be a widow who also got other people killed. Naya's voice was steady, but there was no coldness in it. She was stating a physics problem. Lena heard it as cruelty, and the gap between those 2 interpretations would define our community's fault line for weeks. Through the scope, I watched Victor round the curve. He stopped. I saw his posture change. The loose walking stride locking into rigidity, his weight shifting backward. He had seen them. The 3 drifters were on the road now, maybe 50 yards ahead, moving in that graceless mechanical plod. They hadn't oriented toward him yet. They were still tracking the gradient of the channel's residual moisture on the warm asphalt. Victor did the right thing. He stood absolutely still. No sound, no motion, no flashlight. He became, in that moment, a structural part of the landscape. 0 output, 0 stimulus. The drifters reached the center of the road, paused in a cluster where the drainage runoff had pooled and warmed in the sun, and then continued across, descending the western embankment toward the ocean. Victor didn't move for 11 minutes after they disappeared from his sight line. I counted. Then he turned around and walked back the way he'd come, and he didn't stop until he reached the switchback, and he didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. That evening, Lena came to Naya and asked to see the title data, not apologetically, not contritely, but with the specific, focused attention of someone who now understood that the numbers were not restrictions. They were a portrait of something real. By day 40, we had become something I didn't have a word for, not a community. That implies shared identity, shared history, chosen belonging, not a colony. That implies expansion and ambition. We were a metabolism, 22 organisms sharing a single circulatory system of food, water, shelter, and information, optimized for minimal output, governed by the tidal rhythm of a threat none of us fully understood. Daria and I had developed a working partnership that operated less on agreement than on complementary disagreement. She pushed for expansion, longer reconnaissance, contact attempts on the radio, exploration of neighboring properties during tidal windows. I pushed for consolidation, tighter protocols, smaller footprint, deeper reserves. We argued frequently, always in the kitchen, always at low volume, always reaching a resolution before the conversation ended. Neither of us won consistently. The group benefited from the tension between our positions, and I believe we both recognized that, even when the arguments were genuinely heated. Naya had become indispensable in a way that transcended her scientific contribution. She was the person people went to when they were frightened, not because she offered comfort, but because she offered clarity. She would sit with someone on the ridge at night and explain exactly what the drifters were, what they responded to, what their limitations were, and what the data showed about patterns and windows. She never minimized the danger, and she never inflated it. People left those conversations not reassured, but informed. And information, it turned out, was a more durable form of comfort than reassurance. Oren was building something on the ridge. He had enlisted Tomas and 2 others, a commercial fisherman named Harding and a former park ranger named Dell, to construct what he called a firebreak network, a series of cleared lanes through the scrub that channeled natural airflow and created thermal dead zones where heat signatures dispersed rather than concentrated. It was wildfire science applied to human concealment, and it was working. His daily observations from the ridgeline showed drifter paths bending away from the break zones and funneling into valleys where no humans were present. But the real structural change was one I hadn't anticipated and couldn't take credit for. The group was developing its own internal knowledge system. Glenn, the veterinarian, had begun teaching basic wound care and infection recognition to anyone who wanted to learn. Using supplies from the cormorant's extensive first aid kit, Harding was teaching knot work and net repair, skills that directly supported the intertidal harvesting operation. A woman named Suki, who had been a high school chemistry teacher in Sebastopol before everything, was working with Naya to develop a crude water quality testing protocol using supplies salvaged from the A-frame vacation rental. Knowledge was circulating, not from the top down, not from me or Daria or any designated authority, but laterally, person to person, driven by immediate need and practical application. The community was becoming resilient not because of my walls or my engineering, but because of the distributed competence of the people inside it. This should have pleased me. It did please me, but it also displaced me in a way I felt physically, like a load-bearing column discovering that the structure it supported had quietly redistributed its weight to other supports. I was still essential. The house was mine. The infrastructure was mine. The original engineering that made the cliff habitable was mine. But the community's center of gravity was shifting from the structure to the network of people living within and around it. On day 42, Daria proposed that we formalize the skill sharing into a daily rotation. 1 hour each morning where someone taught something to the group. I expected resistance. What I got was unanimous enthusiasm and a scheduling conflict because too many people wanted to teach. That night, alone in my bedroom, I lay on the mattress I'd hauled up the road myself 6 months earlier and listened to the murmur of 21 other people settling into sleep on my cliff. And I felt the specific, unexpected grief of having built something that no longer needed its builder. On day 47, the radio changed everything again. Daria and I were conducting the dawn monitoring session, scanning frequencies by rote, when a transmission came through on Channel 16, the international distress frequency. It was a male voice, tired and mechanical, repeating a scripted message. Attention all stations. This is United States Coast Guard Sector San Francisco, operating from Auxiliary Station Point Reyes. The federal government has established a maritime evacuation corridor along the Northern California coast. Designated pickup points are active at the following coordinates. Civilians should proceed to the nearest designated point and signal with any available means. Evacuation vessels are operating on a 7-day rotation. This message repeats. He listed 6 sets of coordinates. I copied them down with a hand that was not steady. Oren plotted them on his topographic map. The nearest designated pickup point was 11 miles south, a state beach parking lot just north of Jenner. 22 people went silent as I read the message aloud on the ridge. Then everyone spoke at once. The argument that followed was the most significant and the most divisive we'd had. It split along a line I hadn't predicted. Not between the original 3 and the cormorant group, not between cautious and aggressive, but between those who believed in institutions and those who didn't. Victor, chastened, quieter, but not broken by his experience on the road, spoke first. This is what we've been waiting for. The government is functioning. They have ships. We go. Glenn spoke second. How do we know this is real? Automated broadcast, no live response. Coordinates that require us to walk 11 miles through active drifter territory to an exposed parking lot. This could be a recording from 3 weeks ago. The ships might never come. Daria broke the deadlock by asking the operational question. Can we verify? Can we reach that beach and confirm active pickup without committing the entire group? We could. Oren proposed a 2-person reconnaissance team, traveling light during the deepest available tidal window, carrying the portable VHF to attempt direct contact with the evacuation vessels. If the ships were real, they'd signal back. If the beach was overrun, the team would return without engaging. The vote was quick, 20 in favor, 2 abstentions. Victor and Lena abstained. Victor because he didn't want to wait for verification and considered it unnecessary caution. Lena because she had learned that her instincts about risk needed calibration and wasn't confident in either direction. I respected both positions. Oren and Daria went. They left at 4 a.m. on day 48. During a low tide window, Naya rated at 92% confidence, carrying water, food, the portable radio, binoculars, and a flare gun. They moved along the ridgeline rather than the road, staying above the fog line where visibility extended in all directions. Naya tracked the barometric pressure in real time. I stayed on the spotting scope. They reached the overlook above the state beach at 9:40 a.m. and radioed back. Carver, the parking lot is full of them. 30, maybe 40, milling in the open lot. They're clustering around the cars. Engine heat, probably. Residual from whenever those cars were last driven. There's a burned-out camper van near the beach access. No ships visible. No signs of recent human activity. Daria came on next. I've been calling on Channel 16 for 20 minutes. No response. The broadcast is still running on a loop, but nobody's on the other end. This is a recording. Whatever evacuation was planned either hasn't reached here yet or already passed through. They returned by early afternoon. No contact with the drifters. No signs of any organized presence along the coast. The federal government existed as a voice on a frequency, and that voice was a ghost, a signal without a source, a promise without a body behind it. That evening, I watched the group absorb this information. Some were devastated. Some were unsurprised. Glenn said, "We're the infrastructure now." And nobody disagreed. I dismantled the scheduled radio monitoring that night. We kept the VHF powered for incoming signals, but we stopped listening for rescue. We started, instead, to plan. The plan emerged not from a single mind, but from the accumulated knowledge of 22 people who had spent 48 days learning to read an environment that was trying to erase them. Naya presented the scientific foundation. Her tidal correlation model had been refined with 7 weeks of data into a prediction system with what she estimated was 85% reliability. She could forecast 6-hour windows of reduced drifter density with enough confidence to schedule complex operations, group movements, extended harvesting, construction projects. More critically, she had identified a seasonal trend. As autumn progressed and ocean temperatures dropped, barometric variability increased, and the tidal pattern was becoming less regular. The windows were shifting. By winter, she predicted they would be shorter, less predictable, and more dangerous. Whatever we were going to build, we had to build now. Oren presented the territorial analysis. He had mapped a 7-mile radius around the house, identifying every gradient channel, every thermal zone, every natural funnel that directed drifter movement. His firebreak network covered the immediate perimeter. But beyond that, the landscape was unmanaged. Open terrain where drifter density fluctuated unpredictably. He proposed extending the firebreak concept outward, creating a network of managed corridors that didn't just protect our position, but actively shaped drifter flow across the broader coastline. Not walls, channels. Guide the threat rather than resist it. Daria presented the human logistics. She had inventoried every skill, every tool, every material resource available to the group and organized them into operational capacities. Construction, food production, medical care, communication, reconnaissance. She proposed formalizing these into permanent working groups with rotating membership, eliminating the dependency on any single individual for any critical function. I presented the structural plan, not for the house. The house was already built. For the coast, using Oren's terrain maps, Naya's tidal model, and the labor capacity Daria had organized, I proposed constructing a series of permanent modifications to the landscape within a 2-mile radius. Drainage channels widened or redirected to pull the drifter flow away from our position. Thermal disruption zones created by removing vegetation and exposing bare rock that heated and cooled differently than the surrounding scrub. Acoustic baffles built from salvaged materials. Car hoods, sheet metal, plywood, angled to reflect sound away from the cliff. Not a wall, not a fortress, a shaped environment. A landscape engineered to make our position invisible by redirecting every gradient that might lead something toward us. It was, I realized as I described it, the opposite of everything I had originally built. My fortress had been designed to resist force. This system was designed to redirect attention. The house would remain. The foundation, the doors, the reinforced windows. But it would become the last layer of defense rather than the first. The landscape itself would be the primary structure. The group voted, 21 in favor, 1 abstention. Mine, not because I doubted the plan, because I had proposed it. And I wanted the decision to belong to the community rather than carry the weight of my endorsement. Daria noticed. After the vote, she found me on the deck. That was theatrical, she said. It was structural, I said. If I vote for my own plan, the approval is 22-0 and it looks like compliance. If I abstain and it passes 21, it's a collective decision. She studied me for a moment. You're engineering the sociology now, too. Isn't that what all of this is? She didn't answer. She leaned on the railing and looked out at the dark Pacific, where the cormorant rode at anchor in the cove, unlit, a shadow on the water. Somewhere aboard, behind a locked cabin door, her former captain was still moving. She had never gone back to deal with him. Nobody had asked her to. The boat was Daria's wound, and the group had the decency to let her approach it on her own timeline. We're going to make it, she said. Not a question, not a hope. A structural assessment delivered with the same tone she used to read weather reports. I didn't agree or disagree. I stood beside her and listened to the tide come in. Construction began on day 50 and continued for 26 days. The work was harder than anything I had done alone on the house, and more satisfying than anything I had done in my professional career. Oren directed the terrain teams. Groups of 4, working in tidal windows, cleared and reshaped drainage channels using hand tools salvaged from the Caltrans truck, the Cormorant's maintenance locker, and 3 neighboring properties we systematically harvested during low-tide operations. The work was physical and precise. Every cut, every berm, every redirected waterway was calculated to alter the gradient profile that Naya's model predicted drifters would follow. We weren't guessing. We were sculpting hydrology and thermodynamics into a defensive architecture that had no walls. Harding's fishing knowledge proved unexpectedly critical. He understood tidal flow the way Oren understood fire behavior. Intuitively, physically, as a force that moved through landscapes along predictable paths. He could stand at the edge of a drainage channel and tell you which way the water wanted to go, and from that, which way a body following the moisture gradient would drift. His corrections to our channel modifications improved Naya's predicted flow accuracy by what she estimated was 12%. The acoustic baffles were my contribution, and they were the component I was least certain about. Sound propagation along a rocky coastline is complex. Wind, fog, terrain all create interference patterns that change hourly. I designed the baffles as adjustable panels, mounted on pivot brackets so they could be angled to account for changing conditions. Suki, the chemistry teacher, suggested adding a thin layer of sand and adhesive coating to the reflective surfaces to scatter sound rather than bounce it cleanly. The modification was elegant, and it worked. Our acoustic profile, measured subjectively by Oren from various distances, dropped from audible conversation at 200 yards to near silent at 100. But the most important construction was social. During those 26 days of shared labor, Something changed in the texture of the group that I can only describe as structural integration. People who had been strangers 7 weeks earlier were now arguing about drainage angles, sharing meals cooked from sea urchin and salvaged pasta, sleeping in adjacent bivouacs, and developing the kind of shorthand communication that emerges only from sustained collaborative work. Tomas and Del built a rope and pulley system for the sea cave that tripled our harvesting efficiency. Glenn established a medical station in the 3rd bedroom and trained 4 people as field medics. Lena, who had resisted every protocol and questioned every constraint, became the group's most disciplined schedule keeper, maintaining Naya's tidal calendar on a whiteboard salvaged from the A-frame, and updating it twice daily with a precision that bordered on devotional. Victor, quiet since his walk down the coast road, found his role in construction. He had been a carpenter before retiring, a fact he hadn't mentioned until he picked up a handsaw and reshaped a baffle bracket with 3 cuts that would have taken me 15. He didn't lead. He didn't speak much, but his hands built things that lasted, and the group recognized this with the wordless respect that competence earns in small societies. On day 76, the last baffle was mounted and the last channel was graded. I stood on the ridge at dusk with Oren, Naya, and Daria, and we looked at what we had made. You couldn't see it. That was the point. The landscape looked untouched. Wild coastal scrub, rocky drainage channels, open hillside, but every contour had been adjusted, every gradient managed, every sight line calculated. The cliff house sat in the center of an engineered absence, a place that produced no signal, reflected no sound, concentrated no heat, and diverted every natural pathway that might guide a body toward us. Oren said, "In fire management, we call this a defensible space, but usually the space is empty. This is the first time I've built one with people still inside it." Naya checked her barometer and noted the reading in her journal. The tide was turning. Below us, the ocean withdrew, and the coast breathed out, and nothing came up the road. I spent my life savings reinforcing a house, steel doors, laminated glass, expansion anchors drilled into ancient rock. I made something that could withstand a siege, and then I learned that the threat didn't lay siege. It followed the gradient of heat and sound and motion, and my fortress was a beacon disguised as a shelter. What saved me was not the house. It was the people who arrived and told me, in their different ways, that strength is not the same as impermeability. Naya taught me to read the rhythm of the danger rather than simply resist it. Oren taught me that terrain is a tool, not a wall. Daria taught me that leadership means building something that functions without you at its center. 22 people taught me that a structure without inhabitants is just architecture, and architecture without adaptation is just a monument to a single mind's fear. The house still stands. The doors still lock. The glass still holds. But the thing that keeps us alive is the shaped absence around it. The engineered quiet, the redirected flow, the landscape that whispers nothing to the things moving along the coast. I didn't build a fortress. I built the first draft of one. 22 people wrote the rest.